Okay, fantastic. Let's get started. I know everybody's busy, so thank you all for joining. I'm delighted to be joined today by Tash and Laura, who are just switching their cameras on now. So yes, fantastic to have you all here today. And before we jump into the session, the live discussion, I'm just going to run through a bit of a Q&A on the format of the session, just so everybody knows what to expect. If you joined our last session, which was talking about employer branding and hiring during a pandemic, you'll know that these sessions are incredibly relaxed. The idea being we're going to have a very open conversation about an incredibly important topic. So I hope that this is useful for you to listen into. And with it being so relaxed and quiet, the discussion, really encourage people to take part in the chat. So we've got Daniela, who has recently joined wrkflow, who's going to be facilitating some of the discussion in the chat, and we'll be referring to that chat box throughout as well, just to kind of get your perspectives and really call out some of those experiences that you're happy sharing with us. So again, any questions for the speakers? So we've got Laura and Tash today, who both have incredible experiences in this area. So really make sure that you're putting questions into the chat as well for both of them, and we'll make sure we get around to those. And this session is being recorded as well, so we'll make sure that this recording goes on the wrkflow website very shortly after today's session. So again, just kind of covering the format here, we're going to do a bit of scene setting, so we'll jump straight into introductions, and then I'm going to set the scene with a bit of data that we've been gathering over the last couple of months, and then we're going to break straight into the discussion. And we've got a number of topics here which we hope are going to be incredibly relevant for you, whether you are returning to work or you have recently returned to work, or you're in an organisation looking to transform that process. So without further ado, I'll jump in with an introduction. So for those of you that I don't know or haven't met, my name's Sasha. I'm the founder of wrkflow. We're a dedicated employee experience design agency here in Singapore, and this is our bread and butter. So helping organisations to transform the returning to work experience is absolutely a great example of what we do. So yeah, that's it from me. So Laura, do you want to give us a quick introduction? Tell us a bit about you.
Yeah, sure. Say hi, everyone. I'm Laura Cole. I'm a mum to Henry, who is 2 in January. It's amazing how time flies when you've got a little one. In a work context, I'm head of HR digital service and employee experience at Standard Chartered Bank. What that means is me and my team set the service standards for HR and what we deliver to the business. And then also we're responsible for an employee experience centre of excellence. So we look at end-to-end colleague journey and lots of different experiences that employees will go through, including returning to work and going off on parental leave.
Fantastic. And Tash, what about you?
Hi, I'm Tash. I'm the mother of 2 boys, 6 and nearly 4 years old, but also the founder of Beloved Bumps, and we provide prenatal and postnatal services to couples in Singapore. So we look at the return to work process in terms of our postnatal services, and we're basically trying to connect with women right from when they first get pregnant all the way to returning them back to that workplace. So it's kind of a nice little transition for them.
Fantastic. Well, I'm delighted to be joined by you both today. Full disclosure, we're good friends as well, so it does help. Hopefully that'll help the dynamic of the conversation as well. Again, full disclosure, my side, I am not a mum. I'm a dog mum, but that's about as far as it goes. But I have a pretty invested interest in the return to work process, which I'll come on to talk about from a research perspective. So let's dive into kind of setting the scene here, and then we'll jump into the conversation. So let me just move this slide along. Hopefully this will work for everybody. So to kind of touch on my interest here, so I'm currently in the process of finishing my research proposal for my master's thesis, which is looking at what are the very specific challenges from a workplace perspective with the return to work process. So, and how does that process influence the likelihood of success and the likelihood of successful reintegration of women back into the workforce. So it's been my world for the last few months and will continue to be until the end of the year. And part of that for us as an organisation has been looking at the research that is available at the moment. And through a pretty thorough review of the academic research available at the moment, we've been able to group a lot of the research into 3 primary challenges for women going back to work. The first is maternal, and you'll see some quotes here from the research paper we've done, but the first is maternal, and this looks at the kind of practical maternal challenges that women face. So a lot of this will come out as kind of separation anxiety, and I'm sure Tash will come on to touch on this further into the conversation. But this is about those kind of that emotional connection with your child and how that changes, or the emotions that you feel when you return to the workforce. Societal is another one. So what are the norms around going back to work, and how does that influence a woman's ability to reintegrate into the workforce? You know, are there childcare norms that she is having to adhere to, or, you know, what are the breastfeeding norms as well? And then the last one, which is what we're going to talk about today, is the workplace challenges. So specifically, what is it about workplace design and process design and that transition back to work that creates challenges for women? So we've grouped it into those three buckets, and I think it's also fair to say that there's a real lack of research in this region around this topic. So a lot of the research that you'll find is kind of focused on Europe and the Americas, and very little here in Asia. So hopefully this research paper will start to contribute to that discussion here in the region. Just building on that, if we dig a little bit deeper into the workplace challenges that we do see in the research, there are three components here. So workplace design, so this is kind of your practical, where do women go to pump when they go back to work? Are we providing them with an appropriate and safe space? The second is manager influence, which I know we'll come on to talk about, which is, you know, what role does the manager play in that successful reintegration, and how do their opinions and attitudes influence a woman's reintegration back into the workforce? And then the last is the process. So what is that transition back to work, and what policies or processes have been put in place by the organisation to make that as easy as possible? So a couple of things to really call out here as well. I've been shocked by some of the research, and we'll get into some statistics. A lot of this is qualitative research, and I would be more than happy to share kind of my research list with everybody that's joined us today. But there were some real shocking examples of where women have really struggled going back to work, but also when they have gone back to work, they've received a lot of kind of judgment, or there hasn't really been an appropriate space for them to be able to pump or to be able to carry out their work. And this is made even more challenging with remote reboarding. So again, a topic we'll come on to discuss. Just moving on to some industry research here, just very quickly. So in 2018, a survey of 1,000 returning mums by MLB was published by People Management. We just saw a couple of pretty significant statistics here. So 77% of mothers had a negative or discriminatory experience during and after their maternity leave ended. A third felt so unsupported and isolated upon their return they considered resigning. 90% of those who had already returned to work stated they had little or no support at all, and 18% of respondents felt confident about returning to work. So that's a pretty low percentage considering the volume here of responses. So this is very much an issue, and it's quite an overlooked process. Just kind of look at this from an organisational perspective and why we're here on this call. Why does this matter? So there is, of course, that personal, you know, the importance of that personal experience and making sure that women are supported. But from an organisational perspective, there are a number of factors here. I'll touch very briefly on the motherhood pay gap, but it is definitely a real thing. So a significant wage penalty of 8% 2 years after childbirth, 6% 4 years later, and 3% 7 years later. So it's really interesting to see, and again, this isn't necessarily specific to this region, but really interesting to see that return process has an impact on compensation. Retention, so positive experiences reduce the likelihood of women leaving the organisation and the workforce altogether. It drives engagement, so similar positive experiences increase employee engagement and of course productivity if people are supported back into the workplace. And it also supports an authentic approach to diversity and inclusion, which again we'll get on to talk about later in the discussion, but we really need to encourage organisations to look at this process as though we're moving beyond just hiring women and making sure that they are retained within the organisation as well, regardless of their personal choices and the time they spend outside of the organisation. And then lastly, innovation. So diversity of thought, we absolutely believe in it here at Workflow. So having a real diverse range of experiences and life events is super key to sustained business model innovation. So it's a really important issue, and hopefully today we can shed some light on that with some personal experiences. So from my side as well, before we jump in, I have collaborated with Tash, who is on the call today, and we have built two very distinct offerings, which I'll make sure we distribute to everybody here on the call today. The first is about workplace redesign, which is where we work in partnership with organisations to look at what they're doing at the moment and how we can work together, to redesign that process and create a truly inclusive environment for women returning to work. And the second is a real passion project for me and for Tash, which is actually coaching women here in Singapore on that return to work process. I'm sure Tash will touch on this. And that's been super insightful. We do a kind of day off-site of coaching with women, really to help them prepare for that return and take ownership where maybe the process from an organisational perspective isn't as good as we'd hoped it would be. So yeah, super excited about both of these and really hope this is a useful discussion for everyone today. So just a couple of quotes here from some of the women that attended our course last month, just to really highlight again the importance of this process and what women are really saying. These are women that have just recently returned to work over the last couple of weeks, and we've kept in touch with them. And this is really kind of an ask of these women to their organisations to make that investment in this process and to make that investment in them as employees. So I think we've set the scene. I think we've set the sense of urgency here. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we'll jump into the very first topic, which is the cost of not getting this right. So Laura, do you want to kind of start, maybe share a little bit about your experience if you can, and then talk us through why this is important?
So I think you touched upon it a little bit with some of the research, but I think one of the sort of key things, if it doesn't go well, is that women will leave the workforce. And there's lots of stats where that will be either sort of within 6 months of returning, or it might be across a series of years. And actually, when I was reading some research papers on this, it wasn't actually didn't matter how many children you had, the sort of impact was the same thing. So I think from sort of personal experience, it's very much about you sort of don't change as a person and sort of what you want to get out of work. I was and still am like super ambitious, but just because I sort of had a child didn't change that. And I think what we sort of need to do in terms of supporting women back into the workplace is sort of make sure that they do have the right support, I think, probably physically. And when I say that, I mean things like the workplace is set up if you do need to do things like go and pump if you're still breastfeeding, but also things like on day one that you actually would have a laptop that works. I think some of those challenges are quite common for people if you've been out of the business for a while. Some of the technology can not work. And then I think it's also really having some of that sort of emotional support, so from your line manager, people leaders, those around you. And I think if that sort of doesn't go well, it can lead you feeling really isolated and sort of, does the organisation value me? And I think your sort of capabilities obviously don't change after being a parent, but it's just that series of adjustment in terms of how do you go back to work and really manage those two roles. And definitely for me, that took a while, and I did a lot of obviously in my job we do a lot of research anyway, but sort of did a lot of research myself prior to coming back to work. And I was really I think I was kind to myself in terms of you've got to take it slow and not sort of put too much pressure on yourself to try and sort of force yourself back into working how you perhaps did differently. And that was a big adjustment for me, particularly as somebody, like I say, who is very ambitious and kind of career driven. It was a bit of an adjustment period, and I think sort of being kind to yourself that it will take a bit of time is also really important.
Yeah, definitely. Tash, what about you? What was your experience? Because you've had it both sides, right? Going back to your own business and going back to the NHS.
Yeah, absolutely. I think after my first one, I went back into the NHS, and I think the biggest thing that I was scared about was actually that my brain wasn't functioning anymore. And I'd just been talking about poo for the last year, and suddenly have to be caring for patients again was pretty terrifying. We actually, interestingly, even if we work with mothers and in maternity, we didn't have a great return to work process. we were able to do sort of keep in touch days, which were really helpful, and just kind of working with somebody almost like a mentor, as just to kind of get your brain back in the game. That was invaluable, and that was really, I made the most of all of those. But you know, on day one I was kind of thrown straight back into it again, and I think it's a little bit different, obviously, working in a profession where you're caring for people, and I actually had 2 people's lives on my hand for the majority of the time, and that was a lot of pressure. But then very quickly kind of got back into it, and I don't think that people really appreciate that actually you kind of have that fear of going back in. And I mean, it's better in some ways in Singapore because the maternity leave is much shorter than that we get in the UK. But I definitely think, you know, from seeing our mums now, the lack of confidence that a lot of mums have going back into that workplace and just wondering and worrying about how to juggle it all, how to juggle childcare, what to do with the children when they're away, that guilt that comes with that as well. And then also then having to fully function at work, you know, suddenly it's not just work you're having to think about, you're having to think about so much more. And that's a massive change for everyone.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, what about the cost in terms of confidence? So we touched on kind of the lack of organisational process and preparing to go back, but tell us a little bit about how confident you felt going back. Laura, I don't know what your thoughts are there.
I was like really nervous, and I also now, I think hindsight's a beautiful thing, isn't it? I sort of look back and think, what were you doing during some of your mat leave, where I would go and speak at certain conferences and things like that, and just didn't give myself the time to, I think, be a first-time mum. I was so worried about kind of my position in the organisation, and that people would almost forget about me. And like Tash said, here in Singapore, when I think about that, that's crazy, because the mat leave is like 5 months, so it goes in, you know, in a split second, especially in those early newborn days. But for me, I think it was just that real fear and worry. And I did have a good support network, you know, with my manager, with colleagues in the organisation. But even so, I think I still really worried. And that sort of, like I say, was kind of present in me still trying to be a bit attached to work. So I would, like I say, speak at these events, and I was really in touch. So because it is such a short time in Singapore, you don't have that formal requirement to do keep in touch days like you would in the UK. I know lots of organisations and sort of people leaders will, but I sort of was in touch with either people in my team or the person covering my role a lot. Like, I feel like now, looking back, a lot more than I would be if I had a second baby. But I think that's sometimes just almost that fear of the unknown, and fear of how am I going to go back and then juggle these two new roles that I've got, because it is, you sort of you can prepare for it, but actually until you kind of go back, you sort of don't know what it's going to be like. And I think all that sort of nervousness was kind of there actually before I went on mat leave. So even at the end of my, you know, coming towards the end of my pregnancy, I was thinking about going back to work, which is crazy in a way, but that sort of shows the anxiety, I guess, that I was maybe feeling at points.
Yeah. And was that communication driven by you, or was that kind of like baked into the process of being on maternity leave? There would be regular touch points.
So it was more driven by me, actually, and I agreed with my people leader that I would sort of reach out when I needed some help, or sort of wanted to stay in touch. But yeah, it was driven by me, in the sense of you know, texting colleagues or sort of asking what was going on, which is always a bit not that helpful, to be honest, because it's, you know, things are still going on whilst you're not there, and you sort of had that feeling of I've sort of I'm viewing this party from the outside, but I've not quite, you know, been invited in. It was very strange. So I wouldn't kind of recommend that, actually, in terms of staying too in touch. That didn't sort of work for me that well, I don't think.
Yeah,
I think as well, like, sorry, I think as well in Singapore, it's a little bit different as well, because that anxiety is completely understandable, because your role could change. Like, the amount of women who go back to the workplace in Singapore and their role has either been, you know, it's completely disappeared, or it's a different role to what they left, and there's no protection over your role whilst you're on mat leave. Whereas, you know, in the UK, if anyone changes anything to do with anything who are pregnant or maternity leave, it's, you know, a massive no-no. So I think a lot of women, especially in Singapore, have that founded fear, but it's completely understandable, because if you don't keep in touch, then maybe they will just change your role and you won't know about it until you rock up on day one. So yeah, it's a bit different.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a problem, or a concern, at least across the region as well. So I don't, you know, I think Singapore absolutely, but I think that's kind of shared. And yeah, in the UK, you know, incredibly lucky to have such protection. I think one of, just coming back to that communication topic, Tash, when we had our coaching day with the mums returning to work, communication came up a lot, and kind of we asked the question, do you know what to expect? And has someone been in touch with you to explain to you what that process was? And actually there were a lot of no's in the room, right? And I think, you know, I don't know what your thoughts were there, but it was people were quite anxious about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the amount of people who just like, oh gosh, yeah, if they had just reached out to me by now and asked me. And the other thing was, of course, once they got back into the workplace, how many of them had actually been asked by their manager how they were. And actually one of our mums who has just gone back, and she's got a really young little one, you know, she said, actually, yeah, I got back and she'd done our course, and she's like, and I was just listening for them to ask whether they asked me how I was, and they never did. And she's like, it's made me really doubt my career now. And she's looking to move roles, because she's like, actually, yeah, I meant nothing to them. Like, I just came back and they didn't care how I was. It just threw work back at me. And she was like, and I've just been away having a baby and he's still really young, and here I am, and they didn't really seem to care.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, I mean, I think we can kind of unpack that as well around the role of the manager. But Laura, do you think that within organizations, maybe managers and these colleagues lack the confidence talking about babies or maternity leave, or they're frightened to broach the topic? Do you see that at all?
Yeah, definitely. And when we talk about the return to work experience and people going off on parental leave, it's the sort of people leader, line manager has such an important role to play. And I think sometimes they don't realise how important that is. And it might even be, as you were saying, Tash, something as simple as asking the person how they are, or just thinking when they've delivered their baby, you know, drop them a message, make sure you organise the gift to celebrate them having their child. I think it's easy when everybody's so busy at work to kind of forget about some of those moments. And that's why when we kind of think about it from a employee experience lens, we're talking about what are some of those really small moments that matter, and they're not actually, you know, often really big things. It might be something really small, like we say that, you know, your line manager did contact you, or on the first day, you know, they sent an email around welcoming you back to the office. So I think, and actually what we sort of see is it isn't kind of impacted by gender or other people's experiences. So you'll actually see people leaders who have perhaps gone through the experience themselves as mums still then not do some of those things that I mentioned. And I think it's, how do we sort of support people leaders to be able to really think about some of those things, because they don't take very long to do, but if you don't do them, the impact is really significant, because it makes that person, I think, feel that the organisation didn't value them, the work that they did isn't valuable. And actually having a child is such a sort of big adjustment in your professional and personal life, that you need to kind of acknowledge some of those big moments for people along their journey. And if we don't, I think the sort of impact is huge.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that leads us on nicely to the second topic that we were going to talk about, which is what are those moments that matter. And I think one of the things I've observed, and also being in HR, is we do a really good job at managing that pre-maternity leave process. So, you know, congratulations, you're pregnant. Here is a very structured process of notifying us and agreeing your dates. And, you know, that's kind of the easy, I want to say, part of that process. And then kind of it drops off, people go off on leave, and then nobody has really kind of thought through, okay, what does that structured return look like? Almost like an onboarding process. So I guess from the point of going off on maternity leave to, you know, coming back first day, first week, first month back, what are the key moments for you both within that process that make a difference between whether it's a good or a bad experience? So Tash, what do you think?
I think that actually, I mean, we often would, and especially on the course, we always talk about, you know, firstly, don't start back on Monday, always start back midweek. And secondly, if you can kind of get like a structured, sort of like a staggered return on the way back. But I don't see why that would be so hard for an organization to put in place anyway, you know, for them to say, right, actually your first day back is going to be on a Wednesday or a Thursday. It's not going to be on a Monday. And for that to come from the company rather than like, why do mums have to ask for that themselves? And then secondly, saying, actually, yeah, we have acknowledged the fact that this is a massive life change and you're going to be doing a lot of adjusting whilst you come back to work because you now have to think about a child. So actually, the way that we structure this is that we are going to get you to come back for 3 days a week for the first week. And by the end of a month, you'll be back 5 days if that's what you're going back to, and have that come from the company rather than coming from the mum who's having to ask that or use their annual leave, and just kind of being able to bring them back in slowly and just supporting them in that workplace. Because as Laura said, it is an absolute, you know, life changer. You know, you're not, and as the woman on the course said, that like, we're not the same person who left before we went on maternity leave, that we are completely different people, and we're not trying to be who we were before, but we have the same level of passion, we still can do the same job, but we just need help to get back into that process because we now have something else to think about.
Yeah, definitely. And when should that conversation start for you, Tash? So the thinking about how I go back to work and the pattern, when do you think that conversation should be initiated?
I think definitely giving mums some time off with their little ones, so not harassing them and not going to speak at conferences, Laura. But just letting them have that time with just them and their baby, because they, you know, and you know, I see it all the time, it takes at least 6 weeks for mums to feel even confident with a newborn baby, and that's a minimum of 6 weeks. It takes 3 months for mums to be really confident, like, you know, breastfeeding settled down, they're kind of getting out, the babies have stopped having wind issues, they're feeding better, everything just seems to clear at 3 months. So for me, it would almost be like at that 3 to 4 month mark when they're going back, so almost like a month before they go back to maternity, back to work if they're going back at 4 months, is when you should then reach out and be like, hey, look, you're going to be coming back to work in a month. We really want you to enjoy that process, but in the last month that you have, and then when you get back, we're actually going to do a staggered start, so that by the time the baby is 5 months, you will be working full time again, but we're going to help you with that transition. And at 3 months, then mums are much more confident, babies are much more confident, and so hopefully then that would just make them not have to worry about anything for those first 3 months and really just muddle through motherhood.
Yeah, Laura, what do you think? And what is your, because I know you're conducting research into this area right now with your own employees, so what do they say are the moments that matter?
So when we went out and talked to different colleagues who had recently had babies, we found actually you could sort of book it into before, during and after returning to work. And actually the before bit, like you were saying, Sasha, there is often quite a lot of guidelines around this is like how much leave you would need to take, but it isn't always, I don't think, focused on some of the themes that we've talked about in terms of how would you feel when you go back to work, you know, how could we help you with perhaps a coach or mentor to help you through that transition. That sort of conversation isn't often had before somebody goes on leave. It tends to be more the sort of practical stuff, which definitely has a place, because if you don't go through some of those things, that creates a level of anxiety. But it's even things we sort of saw during, which was, you know, how often is it that you would like to be contacted and by which medium? And even having that conversation before you went on leave then also indicates that you should actually be having some contact. So as we said before, there's some people where there's zero contact from the organisation, from their manager. But actually, if you were having some of those discussions prior to going on maternity leave, that would then be, yeah, okay, so we've agreed if it is at the 3 month mark, this is when we're going to have our first conversation, and these are typically some of the things that we would sort of discuss. The other was actually thinking about decisions you would make around childcare, and sort of even how you would plan out your day when you're first returning back to the office. So even for myself, when I went back to work, I did a phased return. So I worked a couple of days for the first few months and used annual leave to kind of do that structure. And I think that works really well. But as Tash said, we should be, I think, offering that as more organisation led rather than an individual necessarily suggesting it. And what we then sort of saw when people returned to the office, it was even really practical things that people said were moments where they then felt a bit disengaged, which might be nobody knew that I was coming back the day that I was supposed to, or I returned back to the office and I spent the first half of the day trying to get my laptop to work, because since I was off, I didn't do all of the, e-learnings I was meant to do, and then it's locked itself. So then you have to kind of go to IT. There are other people that have sort of talked about needing space to pump. And what we've kind of seen across our sort of colleague journey, the way that we would map out this experience, is actually it was 18 centres of excellence within the bank, and not just in HR, but actually across property, across technology, other functions that need to come together to think about this end-to-end experience. Because if you only do it from a HR lens, then you're missing, half of the sort of challenges that women returning to work would potentially face. And then the other people said that was sort of a defining moment is what actually happens to my career now, and what does my career journey and sort of progression look like? Because I think you would kind of come back to work and have some really, practical thoughts around, my laptop needs to work, I need to find a marine to pump, versus actually what does career progression look like for me now I have to balance these roles as a mum and working potentially full time. So some of them are really small, and actually it's things like sending notifications at the right time, making sure you've got checklists for managers, for colleagues, but some of them are a bit more significant, like having a coach and a mentor as well.
I think the reality is as well, you could have the most perfect process, but bringing managers on that journey to improve the process is really important, because all it takes is kind of one sloppier manager and all of the benefits of redesigning that process go out the window. So I find it really interesting, and even in the research I know I touched on earlier, the importance of a supportive manager and supportive colleagues, as well as a great organisational process. And I think that comes down to process redesign and really creating that seamless experience, like you say, that touches way more than just HR, but also making sure that your managers are trained and people are equipped with the knowledge and understanding to know just how important the process is. I think it's really, really interesting. And to your point, Laura, within that process redesign, how much of a role do you think technology plays in, I want to say, regulating how consistently that process is followed?
I think it's a really important enabler. You're never going to solve for bad line manager or people leader behaviour with technology. You're just not going to be able to do it. But I think what the technology can do is it can create a structure and a series of prompts and checklists and things like that that will then at least encourage and prompt people leaders to do the right thing. But obviously you could, with some of that technology, still completely ignore it if you were, sort of a really poor people leader. So it's not going to sort of, I don't think, always mitigate everything that could happen, but it is really a key enabler. And I think also using some of the technology is a way that you can keep in touch with the organisation without having to do things like log on potentially to your work laptop, where you can use kind of app-based products and things that could be on a personal phone. They're all things that create that ability to stay in touch and sort of know at what point am I in this journey. And that's really helpful, I think, often for colleagues. And sort of to be able to see what's next, I think, is really helpful for people too sometimes. And the technology is great, I think, for doing all of that. But I would say it needs to be alongside really good quality conversations and sort of engagement with colleagues about their experiences with this sort of process.
Totally agree. And Tash, what do we think about the importance of supporting dads as well? So I think this came up during the session that we had. We're talking a lot about mothers' experience, but what should organisations be doing to support dads as well?
Yeah, that was quite interesting, actually. We asked the mums at the end of the course, kind of, is there anything else that they would want to add? And that was one of the first things that came up, which I think took us both by a little bit of surprise. And all of the mums said, well, I just kind of wish that our partners had been able to come on this course as well, because I'm going to go home and tell them that, you know, I feel really empowered about going back into the workplace and this is what I'm going to do, but they won't really understand what I'm going through. And so what they wanted to do was almost have a session for the dads and know how the partners can support their partners, the mums, going back in as well. So, you know, just acknowledging that if, you know, they're on a work call and the baby is crying, then, you know, having that kind of time where they're almost like matching each other's schedules, so that if one person is on a work call, then the other one can help with the childcare. And this is mainly because of, well, obviously from working from home at the moment, it would be different if they were in the office. But yeah, that was definitely quite a good idea as well, like not just the managers and the employers themselves, but also kind of asking the dads to understand what the mum is also going through, not just in the whole process of childcare, but also emotionally. I think a lot of them were very emotional about going back to work and having to deal with the guilt of leaving their kids, you know, with a helper or in childcare. And then on top of that, if they're taking a work call when they're supposed to be doing bath time, you know, that's also plays a huge part in going back to work. So yeah, it was an interesting point which they brought up, I thought.
Yeah, and I think it kind of throws it to, if we're building an inclusive organisation, we need to think about how do we provide new dads with the flexibility to support their partners, even if they don't work for our organisations, because we believe in supporting men and women and, you know, parents, and going through this life transition, if you like. So, you know, I think it's really interesting. And coming back to kind of the org redesign piece, or the process redesign piece in technology, Laura, what piece of advice would you give to people on the call who are maybe thinking about redesigning that process? Where do you start?
So I think what we always do when we look at any experience that we're redesigning is following that human-centered design thinking approach, which basically means you have to talk to the people that go through this experience. So I would say start by doing interviews or focus groups or surveying, or if you can do all three, that's obviously great data, as a way to find out how do people feel as they're going through this experience. So what we would typically do is interview a full range of colleagues, and that would be across different geographies and different levels of seniority, because you sometimes find based on location or seniority, there might be different things that people are experiencing. And then what we would do is create a series of what we would call personas, and that's basically to sort of look at the different types of people or sort of personality traits that individuals would be going through. And normally we would have about 5 or 6 of those types of personas, and you can use the personas to then map out where are going to be potential challenges. You know, if we're going through this part of the experience, how does that particular persona or type of person handle that situation? And then what we would then do, and found this really useful, because with an experience like returning to work, it can feel really huge and kind of a bit overwhelming in terms of, you know, where do I start? So we kind of categorize these into what we would call kind of level 1, level 2, level 3. And level 1 is like really small changes that you could make. So that could be things like, you know, we're going to give people leaders or line managers a checklist, and this is the sort of stuff that they would need to run through. Or we're going to rewrite all of our notifications for emails that we would send out to colleagues that are going out on maternity leave and returning to work. That could be something really small, versus if you were, you know, thinking maybe more of a level 2, level 3 type change. That would be something like, you know, implementing a mentoring program for women returning to the office, as an example, because that's going to require, you know, a lot more sort of resource to be able to pull that together. So I would say not every organisation would have maybe a dedicated EX team like we do, but you can still do some of that research initially, speak to colleagues, and then from there get an understanding of what are the different touch points that you might need to change, and start small and kind of build is what I would say.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, to kind of leading on from that, what are some examples of low-hanging fruit here that organizations can do really quickly? So you said checklists. I think the gift, so making sure that, you know, mums receive a gift when they go on maternity leave. Also, like, how are you doing? At least acknowledging that someone has come back to work. What other examples would you both give as things that might make a difference, but would take less than a day to implement?
I would probably say
focusing some of the activity again on the people leader. So I think it would be a series of things like making sure that you have on their first day, and even working virtually, you can still do this, just obviously setting up meetings over video rather than face to face, but that they have those meetings already in the diary when they join back. Because I think what can be quite challenging is if you've been off for 5 months a year, and your role may have evolved a little bit whilst you've been off, it's, well, who actually are the people that I need to even talk to? So I would almost say to treat this a little bit like onboarding a new hire, because actually it kind of is somebody with, yes, they know the organisation, and they would hopefully be returning to a similar or the same role. They still, I think, would sort of feel a little bit like it's all new and I need some help to navigate that. So I think even something really simple like making sure in the first week there's meetings set up with like key stakeholders or people that they would work with, that know they're coming back, you know, they can sort of get to know how the work's progressed whilst they've been off, what the priorities are, even something like that, really small. But I think you'd be surprised that most people just kind of rock up on the first day and they're like, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. So I think things like that are some of the small stuff, alongside, I would say, checklists, notifications that would go out. It's surprising often, I think, how complex some of those are, and they're always, I get why often they're quite I don't know, like kind of policy processy, because they kind of have to be sometimes to protect the organisation. But you can strip back some of that language and make it more you know, sort of people focused, and then people sort of feel actually the organisation is really supportive of me having a baby.
Awesome. Tash, what do you think?
No, I completely agree on that. I think just literally, as Laura said, having that in the diary before you get back, and literally on the first day, I just can't understand that, you know, when somebody new starts at a company, the onboarding that goes into that, and all of those meetings that are set up and getting them set up, why that isn't the case for mums returning to work is just beyond me. Like, these women have been off for, you know, 4 months, 5 months, even longer, and you've not even been in that organization. So whilst exactly that, you know that how the organization works, and you know roughly what your job is, but it could have changed. And actually just having that meeting on that first day, literally like you're a new starter, should be completely compulsory for every mum returning to work, so that they do feel welcome back, they do feel a bit more settled, and give them a bit of confidence as well, and welcomed back, and then kind of go back into the workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see in the chat as well, so Gillian's just added that she really thinks that reboarding process would be super helpful. Some mention here of imposter syndrome, which is something that we covered in our course as well, because being absent from the workforce for so long, of course you're going to develop those emotions. So yeah, totally understand that, Gillian. And the club idea as well, so connecting parents within an organisation, or I know that there's a platform called Circle In, which I'm seeing lots about on LinkedIn at the moment, which is kind of an external platform for new parents to go and get advice and content and connect with each other. So I think that's a really good idea. And Laura, does SEB connect new parents? Do you have a mentoring program for women? Something similar?
So yeah, definitely the sort of connecting new parents, and that's, as you were saying, I think where technology can also play a role. Because I was really lucky when I was off on mat leave that there were quite a few of us, not in my team, but sort of broader across the bank, who were off at the same time. And we actually happened to all live in a similar area in Singapore, so we'd meet up during our mat leave. But I think that network is so important, because when you come back, I think you need that support of other mums. And I would say you need support of mums that are perhaps at the same sort of period of being a mum, i.e. if it's a, you know, relatively young child, but actually also kind of parents where their children are older, because I think it's sort of having that kind of network. Like I sort of came back and I remember people, I just had that feeling where I was like, I get it now, because I've kind of been through it. And actually I did have, I said this on your course as well, but I had some feedback from my team where they said, you're just so much more relatable now. Because I was talking a lot more about, you know, my son and some of the experience I was going through. So I think having that network and support internally, and where organisations can help colleagues to connect, because it might not be, you know, always easy to do that, is going to be really valuable as well.
Yeah, definitely.
When we interviewed all the mums for our course, so we interviewed quite a few, I think we had about 25 or 30 responses about things that we were going to put onto the course, one of the questions we asked was, you know, how valuable would having a mum's network or a parent's network be? And 100% of the people said absolutely invaluable. And even to the point where mums were messaging me on the side being like, that's what I really need. I needed almost like a group of working mums who were going back, who understood what I was going through, and people who, you know, one of them was going back and she owned her own business. So she was only going back after a month. And she was like, I just felt it was really hard because all the other mums were still off for maternity leave. And I just needed somebody else in my situation going back to work too, to kind of understand those challenges. So yeah, absolutely having a network is definitely important.
Yeah, for sure. And it's something that I would say is relatively easy to implement, and has so much value. So whether that's an organizational group and you're just connecting women coming back with someone that came back 6 months ago, like it's such a confidence builder, I'd imagine, to be able to know that you've got someone in the organization that if things go terrible on the first day, which we have spoken about, sometimes it does go wrong. I know one mum shared a story with us about, you know, rushing to the fridge at the end of the day to collect the milk that she'd pumped and realised that she hadn't pumped at all day, and then just burst into tears. So having someone that you're connected with through even that organisational network just makes it so much easier. Not necessarily easier, but you know, a bit more comforting. So I guess a question that I have kind of off topic here, Laura, as well for you, is why do you think this process is so overlooked by so many organisations? Well, like, why are we talking about this, and why is it such a bad experience for people?
I think when we sort of talked about this actually at the bank, when we map out some experiences, it's one that doesn't happen that frequently, as in you will maybe have 1, 2, 3, however many children you have, but it's not something like an annual performance review, as an example, that you'll go through, you know, every single year. So I think sometimes it's because it's actually really significant when it happens to people. And when you look at the data, there's a lot of people that go through that experience, but they might only go through it 1, 2, 3 times over a sort of set period and then never go through it again. So I think it's quite easy then, if you're a line manager, people leader, to maybe even have never had anybody in your team, depending on the sort of age demographic in your team who's gone through that experience. It's one sometimes I think where if you haven't had a child yourself, it can be less sort of relatable. And like I said, I would put myself in that kind of bucket of try to be really supportive, but actually it wasn't until I went through the experience myself that I was like, okay, I can see so many things now that just make this more challenging. So I think they would be a sort of a couple of the key reasons, just in terms of the kind of frequency of the experience. And I think it's one of those too where typically when people leave the workforce, they're leaving the organisation. So there is that kind of they've left. So it's almost like the out of sight, out of mind. And I think unfortunately, as we've experienced and sort of seen, I think with the research, people often treat it that way too. And that's sort of the key differentiation, I think, in terms of it's not leaving permanently like it would be if you left the organisation and went to work somewhere else, but the person's returning back and kind of treating it as that reboarding, I think, is the bit that's really important. So I think it's sort of a number of factors really that sort of make it a bit more challenging.
Yeah.
As well, it could be like that just companies are still outdated, and that if a woman was going off on maternity leave, that typically she would have then become a stay-at-home mum and not really returned to the workplace. And actually workplaces are just outdated and they haven't looked at it, they haven't thought about it. I mean, the fact that not many women are doing it each year should make this a really easy process, because you don't even really have to think about it. It's not like hundreds of women are having to be reboarded. There's, you know, a handful each year. So maybe it's just that these, you know, especially bigger companies, I mean, I know a lot of big companies have implemented really good processes now, but actually that people just are in that stereotype that the mum will probably be the one who stays at home and therefore not coming back. And that emotion, and people hadn't really spoken about the emotional side of things until now, where everyone's now being like, hang on a sec, this is a really big deal and we need to change it.
Yeah, definitely. I think as well from an EX perspective, you know, when we look at things like onboarding, the volume is there to be like, okay, what's the return on investment here? So if we buy an onboarding solution, we know that there's a return because it's, you know, mass huge volumes potentially for a large organisation. And I think a lot of the time when I talk about, you know, our offering, Tash, in terms of process redesign for organisations, I'm chatting to, you know, heads of diversity and inclusion and saying, this is just as much about the practical elements of bringing someone back into the organisation and getting them up and running and going through that process. But it also says a lot about an organisation's approach to inclusive working environments and how much they want to support the success of the women that work in their organisations, you know. And I do think it goes much more beyond, or much beyond the kind of what is that reboarding process. It's much more about what does this say about our investment in women's careers and making this a fair and equitable place to work, because it is such an emotional process. And even I don't have children, as we've established, but if I observe an organisation that really supports women coming back to work and provides them with mentorship opportunities and technology to support them getting ramped up, I'm like, wow, that organisation is really supporting me, and I'm not a mum, but I feel empowered by that process. It's a really interesting topic. Laura, you seeing kind of the same sentiment at SEB?
Yeah, definitely. I think the sort of diversity and inclusion angle is a really important one, because, and again, I think that's somewhere that is often overlooked as well as part of this experience.
Yeah, definitely. Fantastic. And I mean, from a redesign perspective, what about remote reboarding? So we're kind of coming to the end of the discussion now, but I think it's really important we touch on this because we're all working from home these days. Women are returning to work, but doing it remotely. How does that change the dynamic?
I think probably the biggest one is that your child will probably be in your workplace in the sense of you'll be working from home, and you will have your child in another room being looked after, whoever the caregiver would be whilst you're working, and that's really challenging. And I think that's challenging for any parent when you can hear your child upset or you know, screaming or whatever and you want to call. That can be really challenging. But I think particularly how we've talked about those feelings of anxiety, I think they're sort of exemplified if you're then working from home but your child is sort of still there. I think the other is we're seeing a lot in the sort of future of work and working virtually, that how you build connection is one of the challenges of everybody being remote. And I think given the sort of return to work experience is sort of really focused on connection and almost sort of rejoining the organization, I think there's a real risk of that lack of connection if you are, you know, fully virtual and kind of returning to the workplace and sort of not having, I think it's that almost serendipitous connection that you would have, and I think you would need that when you're coming back into the organisation, like the coffees that you might just bump into somebody here and there, or, you know, have a chat with somebody in the corridor. They're all things that I think when you're returning to work and kind of trying to settle back in, they're things that you would really need. So organisations are going to need to look at how do we facilitate some of that connection virtually. Yeah. Otherwise, I think again the impact is feeling quite isolated. I guess the flip side is that you are able, I think, probably to, if you have the flexibility with your employer, to then manage seeing your child a bit more, and I think that could then actually help the transition, whereas sometimes it can be really difficult, and for some women the first time they're going to work is the longest they've ever left their child, and so I think if you're working from home there is that balance potentially that you would be able to spend a bit more time with your child. But obviously it's very conflicting emotions when you can kind of hear them crying or sort of in the background, definitely.
I know a lot of our mums are really benefiting from working from home in the sense of actually going back to the dads, that the dads are around, because a lot of our mums, especially when you know, they're first on maternity leave, actually the dads are now around in the house, so during a lunch break or, you know, during a coffee break they can actually pop out and help the mums, and then when they are returning to work there are two of them there, so whilst, you know, the boundaries, there are no boundaries because everyone's just in each other's space, they are kind of able to share that a little bit easier, and just kind of feel a bit more supported because everyone's kind of in the same boat. So I mean, it's hard having, you know, if you've got your kids outside, and that was definitely the thing that came out on our course from the mums that we interviewed for it. Everyone was saying that working from home is great in the sense of the flexibility. However, you can just hear your kid crying next door, and if you're on a call, that's really hard. But then from a breastfeeding point of view, it does benefit the mums because they can actually be breastfeeding on a call. You know, they just literally pop the cameras up like this, and then you couldn't actually see anyone. So I'm not breastfeeding, by the way. But you know, so they are able to kind of still have that connection. You know, they just put themselves on mute, and also then again it goes back to that communication of just letting your managers know, letting your your colleagues know that actually, you know, I am just back to work. I'm only 4 months in. My kids are still really young and they're not on solids yet, so I'm still breastfeeding. So if my camera goes off, I'm still here, but I'm probably just feeding my baby. And I think that's definitely a benefit from working from home.
Yeah, definitely. And I think so Laura's just dropped into the chat as well, so similar without children, but there is a need to build more awareness within the workplace. And I really hope the research that we do here and the more that we do to promote the importance of this experience will start to build that business case for a lot of organisations. So conscious of time, but a huge thanks to you both, Tash and Laura. Really appreciate sharing your personal experiences and chatting us through kind of the process of redesigning at Standard Chartered. I think it's been really insightful, and I hope everybody on the call has found that incredibly useful. As I said before, we're going to be posting the recording of today's session, so if you feel like you want to send it on to someone who might find this useful, even if it's a mum looking to go back to work, please do share it. We'll also issue a survey as well. It'd be great to get your feedback on maybe is there another follow-up topic or a slightly different focus that you'd like us to take for another webinar or live discussion. And yeah, we'll share more details on a couple of the offerings that we have. So the course that we're doing for mums, so designed specifically for mums, and Laura supported us with that one the last time as well. So we've got another one of those courses coming up in November here in Singapore. And any kind of organisational redesign process or manager training and leadership awareness around this process, absolutely, we are here to help. So I'll make sure you get a copy of the one pager that I showed earlier. So really appreciate everybody joining today. I hope this has been incredibly useful and empowering. And if you're going back to work, good luck. It's going to go well. It's going to be great. Thanks so much, guys, for joining.